to divulge their water sources. And a couple of years ago, you could go out here and hook your hose up to, you know, your backyard stream and call your water Pacific Northwest beautiful water, and could bottle and sell it without any regulations at all. I mean, the industry is still there to an extent. It's just that many in the industry are looking close now. So it'd be very difficult for someone to do that any longer. But as we move into these bioavailable waters, I suspect that you're going to see some charlatans out there who will not understand the things that you'll understand by the end of this afternoon. And so simply say, well, I can just put a bucket of water up there and call it magic water from Mars. And people will believe it and use it. You see, so we have to sort through that, that maze out there and know what kinds of questions to ask, know what to examine, what to look for, to understand how perhaps this water could be helpful to you in terms of helping your body, or just be nothing. So with that in mind, the size of the cluster does make a difference. And as you can see here, the smaller the cluster, the easier it is by size to allow this water to get into the tissues of the body. And the cells themselves actually respond to the small size of the clustered water. So you will want to be on the smaller end, like roughly 7 to 9 molecules per cluster is where you want to be in the cluster size. There are precise energies that are needed to make atoms and molecules respond. So being in a cluster format, it's like things are touching each other. Each one of those grapes touch each other. Or if we look at things in terms of an onion skin, they're spheres that actually, if I drop water, if I drop an object into the center of some still water, rings go out from where I've dropped it in the water. Remember those pictures of just it getting bigger and bigger, the wing or the wave that goes out? That's the same way in which things are transmitted through these clusters throughout the body. So if I drink water here in my mouth, that water will cascade down, ringing to the different cells in the body, getting broader and broader in terms of what cells it affects as it goes through my digestive tract. Now, these are happening at very small sized elements. You know, I mean, my body's pretty big, and you can imagine the ring getting bigger and bigger, but let's say we're at minute size, smaller than you can see with a human eye. These rings are beginning to emanate out, starting in the mouth, attaching to proteins, and going from the mouth to the esophagus to the digestive tract, and beginning to almost ring a bell in terms of they're touching each other or communicating or sending information to each of the cells. So we want to keep that in mind for just a minute. Now, I've put this up here as a 6-sided figure. And believe it or not, all of the bioavailable waters have the same shape. It's a 6-pointed star. What else occurs naturally in nature that these gemstones, the ruby, the sapphire, the emerald, all have that 6-pointed star shape. All of them. All of the waters that we've listed up here all have a 6-sided figure to them when they're in their bioavailable state. So that's a common denominator for all of them. There are no mistakes in nature. Now this is another shape and another star. And this particular star is a 5-pointed star. That's the shape of the distilled water in nature. It looks like a 5-pointed star. When we add silica to the water at a colloidal size, and I'll explain what I mean there in just a minute, this 5-sided figure goes around that 5-pointed star. So if I were to look with the instruments that we now have to be able to look at the shape of these water molecules, this is what it looks like. Again, getting smaller than the cluster now. And if I had the instrumentation, and there's been one instrument in the world that will allow us to take a look at this, And it was developed by a Russian scientist who is quite a being in terms of his intellectual knowledge. And he's developed this one-of-a-kind instrument in the world that we can actually take pictures of what the water molecules look like at their tiniest size. And when they become bioavailable, meaning when they begin to exert their activity, they all shift to this 5-pointed star shape. No one knows at this point how long they stay in that 5-pointed, what we call a pentamer shape. That's still hot investigation. Someone will probably get a Nobel Prize for it in terms of seeing when does that transition take place. Now in this shape, it's also like a crystal of calcium, which also changes from 6 to 5-pointed shapes as it becomes available in the body. So cluster size, the smaller the better. And I didn't say to you, you want it smaller because you want to cross the blood-brain barrier, get into the brain tissue. Now, I can take regular tap water and drink it, and it'll be hours before it gets to my brain. But the smaller clustered waters will immediately go to the brain and cross that blood-brain barrier. And thus, I'm putting jet fuel in a jet engine. You see? So if we're going to have 90% water up there, let's give it the best, and let's allow it to get there. So the smaller clustered size allows penetrability not only in the brain tissue, but also into your other organs. And if you give me the slide, I think, I'm not sure where it is there, just about that we have membranes throughout our body. In fact, we have electrolysis membranes throughout our body. They're in our brain, they're in our skin, they're in our lungs, they're in our heart, they're in our intestines, they're in our kidney. So they have electrolysis membranes, and that was work done by Dr. Van Noordstrom several years ago. And they're still sorting that out, even though he put that out almost 10 years ago. What does that mean? It means that the body's membranes act like electrolysis units within your system, converting things into different elements than what they were in the beginning. Now, this is the list of the particular electrolysis membranes that he tested in the body. Can you go into a healthy cell for me for just a minute? We hear the word colloid or colloid. We say, what does that mean? A colloid is the smallest particle that we can detect by any of the instrumentation that we have in the body or outside of the body. So you can think of it as the smallest particle that we can actually pick up and examine. That's a colloid. A colloid is neither a solid or a liquid or a gas. It's somewhere in between a solid and a liquid. You can think of a balloon floating on an ocean. That's where a colloid sort of fits. It sort of doesn't fit nicely into any particular category. Now, all foods and all minerals are converted to colloids in order to be able to get into a cell. So they're broken down to their finest, smallest element in order to interface or do something with a cell. I've got to break it down that small. Now, what I put up here was what a healthy cell looks like. And to be noted here is that there is a negative charge on the outside of the cell, and that charge should be negative. On the inside of the cell, it should be positive. And the amount of charge that's there, this is the ideal cell. This is the cell, according to Riem's equation, when everything is working at peak performance. This is what it looks like. And that's called zeta potential, that balance of charges, that extra charge on the outside. Now, when that zeta potential, when those negative charges begin to disappear, disease gets into the body. So I want a high zeta potential. And that's all it means, that the charge that the overall cell is left with should be a negative one. And that's called zeta potential. You're going to see these terms, and I want them to have some meaning to you. So the lower the zeta potential, the worse the cell is. I want a high zeta potential. Now if we look up here, remember we talked about pH? You see 7.3 for the pH outside of the cell, or what we call the cytoplasm. That's the liquid sort of surrounding the cell. And that is where we look at the blood pH. Now when we talk about pH in the blood, I have a very narrow margin there. That shouldn't move off of 7.3. In fact, if I come down lower than 1/10 of a point in the blood, or go up 1/10 of the blood, I'll send you to the intensive care unit. Your body can't tolerate those kinds of movements in the blood. Okay, so 7.3 for the blood, 6.4 to 6.6 for the urine and saliva, the rest of the system. And if you'll notice, in the inside of this cell, the pH is 6.6. So inside of the cell, 6.6, outside of the cell, 7.3 pH. That's where we want to be to make this cell operate at peak performance. Now, you'll see a little cloud 5-sided figure there, which we call a rosetta. Now, you guys are getting some of the latest of what's happening in physics around the world with this particular slide. And one of the problems we have in water is that we've always looked at it from the chemical perspective. We've not looked at it from the physics perspective. And all these colloidal physicists and nuclear physicists and quantum physicists or whatever all have them parlaying in their complicated conferences, having no idea that if you just knew what they knew, the doctors over here could help with some of the diseases. No one talks to the other. Well, in just this slide, this is a combination of biophysics, biochemistry, biology, and medicine. The latest of the information in the world in terms of what's going on. And just that little Rosetta Stone, it took them a century to discover it. Now that's a 5-sided figure. That's the portal. It attaches to protein. And that's the way things get into a cell. Through that portal, through that Rosetta. And that allows all the nutrients, everything you eat, anything introduced to the body, including water, to get into the cell. It goes in through that Rosetta. Now, if you'll notice that little kite-like structure off to the side, you see what's in the center of it. Ca stands for calcium. And it's like a kite. Calcium is the thing that most naturally surrounds the cell and helps to maintain those pHs at 7.3. Water itself, again, when it becomes bioavailable, looks like a crystal of calcium. Calcium looks like a crystal in its colloidal structure. Looks like a 6-pointed figure that converts to a 5-pointed figure when it interfaces with the cell. Crystal. Your water looks just like it. It becomes a crystal. It becomes essentially a hard substance. A 6-pointed and then 5-pointed hard substance that it's not really hard because we said a colloid was neither a solid nor a liquid nor a gas. It's falling somewhere in the middle there, okay? But when things are ideal, that kite, which would be representative of minerals, and when you add vitamin D to it, so why do I say to you, you need to take vitamin D, or make sure you have enough vitamin D to be able to absorb your calcium. This is what it means. It means that in order for that calcium, or whatever the mineral is, to get into the cell, the pH has to be right. The Rosetta has to be sitting there perfectly ready to allow the kite to just go right through that portal. It brings with it enzymes. It brings with it hormones right into the cell. Now, can we switch to an unhealthy cell for a minute? Now, I've put this up here because this represents an unhealthy cell. And what we have going on here, you see our Rosetta here, it's blocked. There's a bubble around it. This is what happens when our pH drops. Suddenly, number one, we get an extra membrane around the cell. And things are having difficulty getting in. They cannot get in. Those same minerals and things can't get into this cell. And in fact, a whole extra bubble forms around the cell. and the cell begins to eat itself. It begins to liquefy and eat itself. This is an unhealthy situation. Enzymes begin to deteriorate. So we have even a different set of enzymes that operate. They can't get in. Now, what was all of this about? We just changed the pH. We made it more acidic. That in turn changed the shape of many things inside of the system. Calcium can't get in here. It's trying. It can't. It's blocked. I can't get into the cell, and the cell actually begins to eat itself. So you can see the importance here of just having the pH right. Something as simple as that. Now, thank you. If I look at the different waters that we've been talking about, again, there's some common denominators, and then there's some not so common denominators. And I thought that I'd try to pull forth some of the common denominators. If I look at infectious agents, as long as that cell looks unhealthy, like the last picture, infectious agents are actually pulled into the center of that cell. They can get in when the pH is off, when things are too acidic. They're actually pulled into the center of the cell. We spoke of lead. We spoke of mercury. I didn't mention cadmium, but cadmium would be another heavy metal that's in our environment and often in our water systems. They are easily pulled into the center of those cells when that cell pH is off. So you can see again the importance of having the right pH available, of having the right thing communicating with that cell. The two waters of all of those that are on the list here, and I've tried to list some of the better waters that are on the market right now, the better bioavailable waters. Common denominator again, they all have the six-sided figure to them. Common denominator. In two of these, two of the oldest waters on the planet right now, I would zero in on the electrolysis for the moment and the deuterium waters. Now, why do I zero in on those? Because most of the research has zeroed in on those. So the academics, they've been around long enough that there are academic studies that have actually been done that you could take to the bank or to court and say, see, I didn't poison my child. I've got studies to show that this works, you know, that kind of thing. And it's not to say that the others don't have them yet. It's too early in the game. We've had brilliant scientists to discover some of these things, and the studies are in progress. But we don't have them totally yet to be able to hang our hat on and say that they work. Now, because water is looked at as a nutritional substance, in fact, the FDA doesn't know where to put it. When we look at medication itself, medicine has a cause and effect. If I give you this, I expect this result from it. That's the old format. That's the way in which we have sort of operated here in the United States for the last little shy of 100 years. Another way of looking at that would be, can I zero in on what caused things in the first place and try to correct that deficit? Now, that's a subtle but very different approach. And when you're dealing with nutritional substances that I am putting water in, because that's the way it's looked at, you're looking at what can it give back to the body to restore what it needs, to allow it to be balanced and to be free of disease. Now, it's a very subtle difference, but a very important one. If I were to show you what medicine does to that same cell model up there, you'll find that only 1% of the medication that you take actually gets into the cell. 99% doesn't do anything, and in fact encourages that cell to get into an unhealthy position. So I feel very strongly that we need to change our whole mode here and start looking at what is the cell missing that we need to restore, as opposed to what I'm going to give you that may make you feel better but may not do anything for your body. If I give you an aspirin, that doesn't really give you anything. That doesn't restore anything to your body. It makes you feel better. Your headache goes away, but I haven't corrected the condition that started the headache in the first place. You get the principle that we're operating from, and why you're going to see a different kind of research coming out. And it takes different parameters to be measured in order to understand how and if and why these waters would interface with the body. Okay? And my gracious, you talk about water, I mean, it doesn't have any color to it. I mean, it all looks alike. I mean, how are these things different? You know, what's going on here? So having said that, in one of the arenas, looking at the electrolysis water, which was discovered originally by the Russians also around the turn of the century, but they weren't so good to their scientists that discovered this. In fact, they took his research, locked him away, and so therefore they didn't get very far with the blessing that was given to them in terms of water because of how they treated the scientist that was given the information. The Japanese picked up on it about 25 years ago, and they began to explore the water. And so right now are the leaders in the world when it comes to electrolyzed water. But as we look at infectious agents, and here I'm talking about bacteria, viruses, and fungi, there's a paper that's about to be released in October of this year where they have looked at the effects on bacteria and the immune system with electrolyzed waters. Now I'm going to back up and say that I don't know how many of you remember the Ebola epidemic that took place in Zaire and Gabon about 5 years ago now. And people were getting this plague. I mean, in 72 hours they were dead. And it sort of stopped. Well, believe it or not, what stopped that epidemic was the electrolyzed water, the microwater, that was sent to the Center for Communicable Diseases here in Atlanta. And that's what stopped that epidemic. They actually cleaned up the camps, they cleaned up the water using electrolyzed water. Now, when we look at infectious agents, and again, I say to you, with the clustered water, I do know that a study was underway, a microbiological study. The students at the University of Mexico rioted for purposes of trying to get their fees reduced, and they totally destroyed the microbiological lab that the set of studies were going on for the clustered water, at least on this side of the ocean. So they were disrupted, so that's going to delay the microbiological studies there. Microbiology in deuterium has been going on since at least 1942, so there are a number of studies around infectious diseases and deuterium. Colloidal silver, many of you were around when we had syphilis was a real problem up until the 1930s, and during that time people used to be injected with silver to try to treat syphilis. Penicillin was allowed to be released. It was discovered well before then, but they finally let it be released, and now penicillin is the antibiotic that's used for syphilis. But silver is used in the treatment to prevent syphilis from mothers that may be infected with syphilis, and as the baby comes through the birth canal, we actually put silver drops in the eyes of the infants to keep the child from getting syphilis. I mean, it's an old thing, but it's still done in every hospital in the world to prevent herpes and syphilis from the babies getting it, because that was a major problem, a real public health issue for years. So silver has been around in terms of a bacteriostatic agent. Now, what do I mean by bacteriostatic? Here we mean to keep the levels down versus being able to treat or kill. Silver has been known to keep the levels down, but it does not kill the organisms. Now, it appears in what Mr. Rowland has done with his water is to add frequency to it, which we'll get to in just a minute. So you're keeping the levels down, but then you're adding frequency to it also. I say that because the studies have not come forth in terms of actual documentation above its use with E. coli. So the silver, he does have the documented studies in reference to E. coli and its effects, but not for any of the other organisms. It's looking pretty good in the arena of viruses, specifically herpes, but those studies have not been completed yet. When I look at the electrolyzed water as it relates to organisms, we've talked about the plague or the Ebola epidemic and that being stopped by it, but they also have found that this water kills on contact. Not 20 minutes later, 15 or 20 minutes later. Well, if I give you chlorine, which we talked about earlier, but it's a bleach, we tend to use that to wash our counters down and wash our clothes with the idea that it's going to kill bacteria and things that would be in our clothing. That normally takes 15 to 20 minutes to have that happen. When we use the low pH micro water on the acid side, what we find is that it kills on contact. So here you have an environmentally safe element that you can use for cleaning and for sterilization. In Japan, they actually sterilize their instruments. They wash down the surgical suites just with that water. So again, you can see applications. In the meat industry, you see them washing down the carcasses with the water. It kills E. coli on contact. We wouldn't have the issue that we have now here in the United States with E. coli in the meat packing plants or in the restaurants or in catering houses if they just used electrolyzed water. Just to show you that the technology exists. But for some reason, we're not there yet here in the United States. And every time I hear another E. coli epidemic, I get a bit perturbed because I know the technology exists very simply to be able to just offer that and save a few lives. Now, they also found that the polio virus, type 3, is killed within 60 seconds using the electrolyzed water. The HIV and hepatitis bacterium are also killed within 30 seconds. Now, these are the documented studies that are out. Sort of makes you wonder, why are we still running around with these diseases when this stuff exists on a worldwide basis? The paper that's coming out in October is showing that in addition to the organisms that I've just mentioned, that T lymphocytes and memory T cells, now these are all cells that are in the body that are there to boost your immune system so that you can fight off bad infections, or you can fight off or give a boost and prevent having cancer. The paper is going to demonstrate that there is a boost in SOD activity and in the T lymphocytes. Their level is maintained so they don't drop, and there's a boost to the memory T cells. So it will allow your immune system to respond to infectious things and to work against cancer. In the B cells, which are there for allergies, now you tend to get a whole slew of B cells in your system. Think of them as little bees. When you have allergies, those drop when they're introduced to the electrolyzed waters. So these are documented studies that you can give people something to hang their hats on, when it happens. In addition to that, lupus, they've noticed, now these are in mice studies, the lifespan of the mice has been increased by 2 months just by them drinking electrolyzed water. Now, that's tantamount to about 10 years in a human with individuals who have lupus. In rheumatoid arthritis, we get a similar increase in lifespan. Again, just drinking electrolyzed water. Now, something that we have found in the last couple of months. Now, in the last couple of years, you've heard about ulcers, and we all used to think about giving milk to individuals with ulcers. I don't know if you remember those days when everybody drank milk if they had an ulcer. Well, if you'll remember, about 1.5 years ago, we identified an organism, a bacteria, that was a cause for the ulcer in the stomach. Now, when I was in medical school and still in medical school, they're taught that bacteria cannot grow in the digestive tract because the acids are too strong in the stomach, And just past the stomach, now you have two organs just past the stomach that hit the small intestines. One would be the gallbladder, and it's squirting its juices, which are alkaline. Again, pH stuff, guys. Alkaline, okay, the higher pH, to try to counterbalance the acid coming off the stomach. You just left the stomach. Now we got to cool that acid stuff down, those juices, so that they're not so acidic. So bile, comes from the gallbladder to try to counteract it or make things not so acidic. So you have a strong alkali, therefore, coming off of the first part of the intestine, and strong acid in the stomach. And from everything we knew, no bacteria would grow there. Well, guess what? In the last couple of months, literally within the last 2 months, we've just discovered that not only do we have bacteria in those areas that grow very beautifully, they're resistant to antibiotics. So you come back again and say, holy Toledo, what are we going to use to treat these organisms? It comes back to frequency again. We must have something that will kill these organisms because the antibiotics won't work. Well, the strep and staph and resistant TB, and strep causes rheumatic fever, and many of you will remember in the 1950s we had an epidemic of rheumatic fever. Some of you may have been affected during that time. I know a number of people that were. There was a large TB epidemic. Well, things are equal to what they were in the 50s again. And we have resistant organisms of both tuberculosis and of strep. In fact, it's gone so far now that the strep is actually eating flesh. They're so resistant to the antibiotics, and I mean, we can't get any stronger on the antibiotics. I mean, we're essentially giving chemotherapy now, very comparable to cancer chemotherapy on the antibiotic side. So what are you going to use? Well, believe it or not, these waters will work. The documentation that we have so far is in two of them, the electrolysis water and the deuterium water. That does not say that some of the others will not also do that. It's just that the studies have not been done yet to actually prove that. But in both the electrolysis water and the deuterium waters, there is evidence, there's academic proof that they will counteract even these bacterium that are resistant to antibiotics. So I can use water as opposed to some very strong antibiotics. I think I'd go that way as opposed to some very detrimental cell toxic material that will create other problems in the body. So you get a sense that maybe there is a little bit more to water than just something that I simply drink. Let's see if we can differentiate some of the different waters that we have here, and just bear with me a minute. And we'll go right down the pike if we can. Electrolysis, and you remember the slide I showed you with the platinum and titanium, the chemical chart. We'll put that up for a minute here. As I said to you, between platinum and titanium, there's a whole slew of elements that are very unstable biochemically. And the common denominator for those elements is that when they're heated to a particular temperature, or other types of energy are introduced to them, those elements disappear. Now, I said to you that the brain, the fast-moving brain, has iridium and rhodium in it. In fact, the old cannibals that used to eat all kinds of brains, and some of you may like pig brains and beef brains, whatever, too, we find that they are loaded with iridium and rhodium, too, okay? But those fast-moving brains, we'll go back to dyslexia, we'll go back to the so-called attention deficit individuals. They're loaded with iridium and rhodium in those brains. So much they're processing very, very fast, from infancy all the way up to puberty. They're loaded with iridium and rhodium. Now, when the water passes over platinum and titanium plates, which are the plates that are in the electrolysis water systems, they convert the water into these middle elements, iridium and rhodium, okay? So what you're doing, because there's an alchemical process that takes place, and that would be extracted from the water. And so you're beginning to give back to the brain what it needs to operate at peak performance. So you're putting jet fuel in a jet engine. Get the idea of what's going on there and why platinum and titanium just happen to be picked as the two elements that the water passes over. Things are turned into a non-toxic format. So much so that, and so selectively that, I said to you it would wipe out any bacteria, the flesh-eating types of bacteria. Anything that produces a toxin cannot withstand the frequency generated in electrolysis when the plates are made of platinum and titanium. I don't care what it is. But if it's a good bacterium, I got strep in my mouth that allow me to make saliva so that I can break down some of my foodstuffs. I have lactobacillus in my digestive tract that will allow me to break down dairy products, okay? I don't want to wipe those out. Guess what? It won't wipe those out unless they begin to produce a toxin. It's that selective. So we're talking about an extraordinary frequency that's generated here. You know, the things are happening. It will convert lead to a non-toxic format. So if you have lead in your water system, if you have chlorine, if you have fluoride, whatever, they're converted to a non-toxic format. It also provides negatively charged ions to the liver. And thus, they are used and certified by the Minister of Health of Japan and the head of the Russian Academy of Sciences for use in cirrhosis of the liver. Now remember we talked about there being electrolysis membranes throughout your body. Well, we start the process in the beginning. So that kidneys, heart, liver, brain, all are able to receive this very, very easily. You get the principle about what we're doing, okay? Now, the frequency that's generated there is on the lower spectrum. I tried to group some things as we get to higher and higher frequencies here. So at least for everyday kinds of drinking water, you could feel pretty safe in terms of drinking this, because it doesn't matter what's in your water system, whether it's a metal, whether it's a gas, whether it's an organism. It's going to be rendered helpless when it's introduced to these waters. In fact, slugs, if you begin to spray it on your plants, they don't die, they just run away. Parasites run out of your digestive tract. It will not kill them in the drinking water frequency. It will chase them out of your system. But things are changed to a non-toxic format. Let's move on to the clustered water. When I look at the clustered water, it's first small clusters again, so I can easily get into the cells. I've said to you that water is a magnet, so it's going to pull to it whatever it comes in contact with. Now, if I happen to put some good things next to it, those good things are going to go into the water. If you just sat a glass of water on a table and you put, well, what shall we put next to it? Okay, a bowl of fruit next to it. After a certain period of time, all the elements in that fruit will be in that water. If you have the equipment available to evaluate what's in that water, in not too long a period of time, fruit will be evident in that water. That's how magnetic water is. Whatever's next to it. It can become a battery in itself. You could put a battery here, and in short order, that water would become a battery. Whatever is next to it, okay, it's going to draw. That's why it becomes very important in what kind of container you put your water in. Ideally, for the kinds of containers that we have available, glass would be one of the slower leaching types of materials to put your water in. because it's going to take its time, and there are natural materials in the glass that if it leaches, at least that's what's going into the water. If you're going to use a plastic container, you want to use one that will slowly leach into the water. Again, be as close to the glass as possible. So the thing to look for in the bottom of your containers is always this little triangle, and look for the number 7, because it means that is the closest to glass that you're going to get in terms of a container for water. And if you'll look at things like some of the milk cartons or whatever, they're like a number 1. And it's pretty easy for that plastic to get into your containers. And that bothers me a bit as we talk about distilled waters, in that most of the distilled water that you're going to get from your grocery shelf is a number 1 container, number 1. But secondly, it will have sat in the warehouse next to who knows what. We test the distilled waters when they've come in, and I've yet to see one above 5.5 for pH. So you're starting out backwards already with putting a very acid thing in your system that you're mixing things with. Now it bothers me when I hear this thing about using steam distilled water. That's a joke, guys. All distilled water is steamed. In fact, one of the manufacturers changed their label steam distilled because everybody was asking for it. They think it's a big joke. You know, all distilled water is steamed. In fact, it's the water that's collected at the top of the steam vessel. You know how the water boils and the steam comes off? Well, in the distiller, that water that comes up as steam is collected, and that's the water that comes out. Now, that's good, except for whatever else boils at 100 degrees will also come into that steam. So the things that don't boil at 100 won't come up there. They'll stay in the bottom of the container. But those that boil at 100 degrees will come with your steam water into your jug, which could be some of those trihalomethanes and a few other items that you don't want, vaporous kinds of things that were in the water to begin with. Now, what you hear people talking about is double distilled water. That's usually laboratory grade distilled water. That's very expensive. And it is used in laboratory settings for most of their experiments, etc., in terms of, their use, where they must be precise. And that is very specially treated distilled water, in that they're sure there's nothing in it. So please don't get confused there in terms of distilled water. Now, what Dr. Lorenzen has been able to do is, because everything that gets near water is picked up by water, if one could control, therefore, what the water is next to or introduced to, then I could put some good things in there too. And so what happens, we hear the word template. I would take something that's good, put it in the right quantity that I would like to have it emanate the right frequency, and put the water next to it. And now that's transferred into the water, because water has quite a memory. And it will remember what you put next to it. So if you start with a good distilled water, put next to it something good, then that will be absorbed into the water. And thus we enter the arena of homeopathics in terms of putting something next to that can be contained in water that will hold it. Now what he does is use a cold sterilization process and administer a very strong magnetic pulse to the water. And thus he has small clusters. So we've got that memory and we have that structure. Remember, that's important. And then we've added to it the right frequency of a particular element, a good element that you want in the water. And that's how that works. So when we talk about the water being in its clustered format, we are then translating to the water, who then translates to each one of those cells. It gives the message to each one of those cells what you want those cells to say. Now, what's the importance of that? Let's take a look at diabetes for just a minute. When I look at the pancreas, There's an enzyme made in the pancreas called trypsinogen. It's an enzyme. And in the small intestine, we have sort of the end point, or trypsin, is the final format that we want that particular enzyme that comes from the pancreas to be in, to be able to help digest our foodstuffs. Now, we couldn't account for that enzyme coming from trypsinogen to trypsin by simply saying, well, oh, just something happens in there, and I had trypsinogen, and now I got trypsin over here in the small intestine. Couldn't figure it out. Except through the equipment that we now have, we could measure, and we found out that trypsin was surrounded by 300 different receptors for water. In almost an onion format, they surround the trypsin enzyme. And there's a communication system, just like those ripples of water that go out when I drop something in the center of a silent pond and the rings go out. Well, by having a message transferred by a strong magnetic pulse to the pancreas that says, I need to make you into trypsin, that message is transferred ring by ring, water ring by water ring, to make it trypsin in the small intestine. Can you see what's happening there? He's actually making the water, because again it becomes a frozen crystal, very similar to the format of water at the bottom of glaciers. Now we know that the best water, the best structure for water that will carry information the best, is coming from the bottom of glaciers. And what he has managed to do is to come up with a way to replicate that structure as if they're coming from the bottom of glaciers. And people, the latest thing out is that people are selling chunks of water coming from the bottom of glaciers. That's the hottest thing going right now. Some entrepreneur is now cutting chunks of water and is selling them for $25 a bag. So I'm sure someone will soon be up at Mount Rainier trying to get to the bottom of the glacier to cut the chunks out to sell. I mean, but it's that principle that we're working with. And I'm going through this because each one of these waters is made differently. We get to a similar endpoint because of the amount of energy, the amount of frequency that's translated in each one of these waters. So thus we're getting a healing effect. But again, remember, we're starting with a battery up here. So we're talking about electricity to begin with. If I can get the right electricity going to the brain, then that brain's going to begin putting out the right product. But I got to get the water to it first. So it has to be small enough to get there. Once it's there, will it translate down to the cells? See where we're going? And so we're moving up the scale here in terms of the way it goes. If I move to the next water for just a minute here, deuterium water. And what's the significance of it? In 1933, many of you were around to remember the development of, which is when the atom bomb, they began the development of it. Deuterium is an element in the production of the atomic bomb. Heavy water made from deuterium. Now, deuterium itself is just what we call an isotope of hydrogen. It's another form of hydrogen. There are 3 forms of hydrogen. You can look at it as just ordinary hydrogen. You can look at deuterium as a second type of hydrogen within the hydrogen molecule, and tritium, which is the third type of hydrogen within the hydrogen molecule. The problem with the third one there is that it's radioactive. Deuterium is not radioactive. It is in almost every element on the earth. You'll find deuterium. You will specifically find it, or especially find it, in seawater. It's loaded with deuterium. So that what happened, Dr. Story, in his guilt from being one of the individuals that was responsible for development of the atomic bomb, decided that I better do something for mankind that might be useful with deuterium. he probably had, not probably, he had more incentive too, because all the scientists that were involved with the development of the atomic bomb all wound up having radiation exposure. And so they were getting sick and they were dying. So they had to come up with something that would keep them alive, including, he himself. And in the process of things, he developed deuterium from a healthy perspective. And what we find is deuterium comes in a couple different formats. It comes as deuterium oxide, which would be heavy water. And to be noted, D2O is the chemical formula for that. You only want a little bit of deuterium oxide in your body. Otherwise, that begins to tear the body apart. You do not want deuterium oxide. It will collect in the liver, it will collect in the fat cells, and begin to destroy the body. So please take note. You don't want heavy water in your body. What you would like perhaps to have would be deuterium sulfate, D2SO4. And in that format, as long as it is not in very, very heavy concentrations, we find that good things start happening in the body. And of particular note, tumors begin to dissolve. They begin to liquefy in a very short period. In fact, they're talking about a 30-day time frame for tumors to completely dissolve, whether they be cancerous tumors or not yet cancerous tumors. Deuterium has the other property of taking from water that's already in the body oxygen, but good oxygen. Now we looked at oxidation. Remember, we looked at the rust and the body rusting. So we don't want the bad oxygen. We want to tie that up. Deuterium releases the appropriate type of negatively charged hydrogen to tie up the free radicals, number one. But it also releases what we call a nascent oxygen that can in fact give oxygen back to the cells. Now, in ancient times, the Earth's atmosphere was 30% oxygen. It's now 14% oxygen. That's our atmosphere. We're living in a time of oxygen deprivation. You go into coma when the oxygen drops down to 10%. So we're in trouble, okay? Now, deuterium sulfate in the body has the property of releasing the good oxygen from the body, so that especially with individuals that are having difficulty with their lungs, they find that they're getting more oxygen in their cells, usable oxygen. So asthmatics, they're reporting that asthma is totally cured within a 2-month process. So you can see perhaps what's going on here. The thing to look for in deuterium waters is that they not be too heavy a concentration, that they be essentially homeopathic concentrations of deuterium sulfate. And some of you will remember shaking up the anabolic water, which is available on the market right now, and hydroxygen. You're shaking it just to stimulate the frequency of the homeopathic in the deuterium. It is a major player. You're going to hear a lot more about deuterium in the very short future. It's one of the better waters available, especially for cancer, especially for lung problems. And I'm going to group together here for diabetes also. All three of these waters that I've spoken of so far, the electrolysis water, the clustered water, and the deuterium water, are excellent for diabetes. We've talked about the clustered in terms of the communication network that's established by the way that's made. What we have found, again, this is all new research, in the diabetic, especially in infants with juvenile diabetes, they've isolated some viruses in their pancreas. Remember again, these organisms weren't supposed to be in that part of the digestive tract. They weren't supposed to be able to live. Well, they have found E. coli and viruses in that part of the digestive tract. And they suspect very strongly, again, they're resistant organisms. that is a cause for diabetes. All three of these waters will attack the pancreas, E. coli, and viruses. And thus we find that diabetics are responding very well to these waters. When we increase the frequency, it means things happen faster. So we start at one frequency, we go up higher and higher as I'm going down the scale here, so that things will happen with all of them. Some it will happen with faster than others. So it's like, welcome to a whole new world of water. And you can get a sense that there is something happening to the body with these waters. I'm going to mention for a minute the equator here and Dr. Werner Kropp, because I have to give him credit for a lot of the work in this arena. Dr. Kropp was a Swiss scientist who discovered all of this stuff around 1930. And he's the one that taught the Russians. And the Japanese visited him, and the Saudis and the Egyptians. He discovered zeta potential and started talking about zeta potential during that period of time. He went up for a Nobel Prize for several years, was turned down. But I've been to his place, as I say. These coinkydinks, I just happen to wind up in these places. And unfortunately, he was killed for his technology. One of the mafias offered $100 million for his technology. He turned him down. And within 2 weeks, he was dead. Now, I have actually seen, through the use of his particular little system that uses strong magnetic pulses in it. I don't know all the particulars about it because, again, it's a proprietary process. But I know that when we poured water that had cholera in it, we poured it through 3 times, and that water became drinkable in terms of the infectious organisms that were in it. I know that a larger version of it has been used in Chernobyl, and when water has been poured through it, it was converted to IV solution. It was that sterile. So I know these things exist, and I must give credit to him for the initial pioneering work that he did. There are 4 scientists that so far have been taken away from us because of their work in these waters on an international basis. A word about crystal energy, which works basically on the same principle that the clustered water works. The question that we have with the crystal energy at this point, and only Dr. Flanagan can answer the question for us. Remember I talked about that very sophisticated piece of equipment, that there's one of a kind in the world, and we can actually look at things at the colloidal level and see what's in them, whatever. We're noticing that there is a soap made from a potassium base in that particular element. And it is used to make the water cluster. The problem we have that when we add that type of soap to water, it means that the viscosity drops. When the viscosity drops, the pH drops. And that element becomes toxic. But again, you wouldn't see it through all the normal chemical analysis, through all the normal physics analysis. It looks good. We see clustering. We see effects on the body. It's the long-term effects that we have problems with. When we start talking about colloids, and again, now you know what a colloid is, and the importance of colloids in terms of being able to get into the cell. Very few things are true colloids, even though they're reported to be. In fact, we only found one that was truly colloidal when we examined it, even though on the label they were all said to be colloidal minerals. So that you want to keep that in mind. Silica that is not colloidal can be destructive to the cell. When it is combined with one of these bioavailable waters, it will pull things into the cell 10 times faster than anything else you could add to it. So it's fine if we're pulling good stuff in. It's not so good if we're pulling bad stuff in. You know, the Sufi water, they tell us environmentally works extremely good on cleaning up the environment. We're seeing that the petrochemical